I have spent 3 years perfecting the art of looking away. It is a skill no governess ever taught me, no mother ever warned me I would need, yet it has become as essential to my survival as breath itself. The ballroom glittered that December evening like a jewel box lined with lies. Chandeliers dripped with candlelight, casting golden halos over the cream of London society as they swirled across the parquet floor in their silks and superficial smiles. I stood near the marble column by the terrace doors, a glass of champagne growing warm in my gloved hand, and practiced my most rehearsed expression, serene contentment. Lady Eleanor Ashford, devoted wife, admired hostess, a woman who had everything a woman of her station could desire. The music swelled, a waltz I had heard 1,000 times before, and I watched the dancers spin past me in a blur of color and movement. Somewhere in this glittering crowd was my husband. I had learned long ago not to search for him too obviously, not to let my eyes betray the questions that lived like thorns beneath my ribs. William had his obligations, his business associates, his endless social maneuverings. If he chose to spend his evenings away from my side, well, that was the prerogative of a husband, was it not? I was 24 years old, mistress of Ashford Manor, bearer of an ancient name and a considerable fortune that had passed into William's hands the moment I spoke my vows. What more could I expect? What more did I deserve? The December air seeped through the open terrace doors, carrying with it the scent of frost and dying roses from the garden below. I shivered despite my velvet gown, despite the press of bodies and the heat of 100 candles. There was a coldness in me that had nothing to do with winter, a hollow space where warmth should have been. I had felt it grow wider with each passing month of my marriage. With each night William came home late, smelling of perfume that was not mine. With each morning I woke alone in our grand 4-poster bed to find his side barely disturbed. Lady Pemberton swept past me in emerald silk, her fan fluttering like a butterfly's wing as she whispered something to her companion. Their eyes slid toward me with that particular expression I had come to recognize, pity mixed with satisfaction, the look of women who were grateful their own marriages, however cold, were not quite as humiliating as mine. I lifted my champagne glass to my lips and took a sip I did not taste. The bubbles felt like tiny accusations against my tongue. I should have left William by now. That is what my mother would have said, if my mother were still alive to say anything at all. But where would I go? Back to the empty house in Hampshire where I had grown up. Back to the memories of a father who drank himself into an early grave, and a mother who died of a broken heart, though the doctors called it consumption? No. I had made my choice 3 years ago when I accepted William's proposal, when I convinced myself that his handsome face and charming words meant something true. I would live with that choice. I would perfect the art of looking away. The music changed, a new waltz beginning, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever I allowed myself to remember what it had been like in the beginning. William had courted me with poetry and promises, with rides through Hyde Park and whispered confessions of love beneath the stars. He had made me believe I was precious to him, that our union would be different from the cold arrangements that passed for marriage in our circles. What a fool I had been. What a naive, desperate fool. Someone cleared their throat beside me, and I turned to find myself looking into a face I did not recognize. He was tall, perhaps 35 years of age, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of smoke after rain. There was something striking about him. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but arresting in a way that made my breath catch. He wore evening dress with an elegance that suggested wealth without ostentation. And when he bowed, the gesture was neither too deep nor too shallow, perfectly calibrated to convey respect without servility. "Good evening, Lady Ashford," he said. And his voice was low and steady, with an undercurrent of something I could not quite identify. Amusement, perhaps, or sadness. I inclined my head, suddenly aware of how I must look to him. A woman alone at a ball, abandoned by her husband, clutching a glass of warm champagne like a lifeline. "Do I know you, sir?" "You do not," he replied, and a faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Though I know you, or rather, I know of you. You are Eleanor Ashford, formerly Eleanor Hartwell of Hampshire. You married Lord William Ashford 3 years ago in a ceremony that was by all accounts the social event of the season. You reside at Ashford Manor in Mayfair when in London, and at Thornfield Park in Derbyshire when the season ends. You are admired for your taste, your grace, and your discretion." That last word hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt my fingers tighten around the stem of my champagne glass, felt the familiar armor of polite indifference settling over my features. "You seem remarkably well informed about a woman you have never met," I said carefully. "May I know to whom I am speaking?" "Lord Sebastian Hargrave," he said, bowing again. "And you are quite right to be cautious. It is unseemly for a stranger to approach a married woman with such familiarity. I apologize for my forwardness." He paused, his gray eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, to retreat back into my practiced invisibility. "But I am afraid I have something to tell you, Lady Ashford." And I could not in good conscience remain silent. My heart began to beat faster, a drumbeat of dread against my ribs. I wanted to stop him, to hold up my hand and refuse to hear whatever words were about to shatter the fragile peace I had constructed. But I did not. Perhaps I was tired of the pretense. Perhaps some part of me had been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally say aloud what everyone already knew. "Your husband," Lord Hargrave continued, his voice gentle now, almost kind, "is at this moment in the garden with Mrs. Vivian Crawford. They have been there for the past quarter hour. I thought you should know." The ballroom seemed to tilt around me. I heard the music as if from a great distance, saw the dancers blur into streaks of color that made no sense. Mrs. Vivian Crawford, the widow with the auburn hair and the low-cut gowns and the laugh that carried across crowded rooms like broken glass. Of course it was her. Of course William would choose someone so obvious, so brazenly inappropriate. The humiliation of it burned through me like fever. "I see," I managed to say, and was proud that my voice did not shake. "Thank you for informing me, Lord Hargrave. I am sure you meant it kindly." He did not move away as I expected him to. Instead, he took a step closer, near enough that I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and winter air that clung to him. "I did not mean it kindly," he said quietly. "I meant it truthfully. There is a difference." I looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time, and saw something in his eyes that I had not expected to find. Understanding. Not pity, not satisfaction, but a recognition of pain that mirrored my own. It made him dangerous in a way that William's indifference had never been. It made him real. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said, and I almost believed him, or perhaps only this. He extended his hand toward me, palm up, an invitation that seemed to hang in the air between us with all the weight of a choice I could never take back. "Dance with me, Lady Ashford. Let them see that you are not broken by his cruelty. Let him see it when he returns from the garden with her perfume on his coat." I stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a coiled snake. To accept it would be to acknowledge the truth I had spent 3 years denying. To refuse it would be to remain exactly where I was, trapped in a marriage that was killing me by inches, perfecting the art of looking away until there was nothing left of me to see. The music swirled around us, beautiful and terrible in its relentless rhythm. I thought of William in the garden, his hands on another woman's waist, his lips speaking words he had once spoken to me. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake listening for his footsteps, all the mornings I had greeted him with a smile that felt like a knife in my throat. I thought of the woman I had been before I married him, the girl who had believed in love and poetry and the possibility of happiness. That girl was gone. But perhaps another woman could take her place. Perhaps a woman who had learned to look away could also learn to look forward, to step into the unknown with her head held high and her heart, however battered, still beating. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table. I peeled off one glove, then the other, letting them fall beside the glass like discarded pieces of armor. And then, before I could change my mind, before fear or propriety or the ghost of my mother's warnings could stop me, I placed my bare hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and sure, and I felt something shift inside me, some tectonic plate of my carefully constructed world cracking along a fault line I had not known existed. "I would like that very much, Lord Hargrave," I said, and heard the tremor in my own voice, the first honest sound I had made in longer than I could remember. He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less haunted. "Then let us give them something to talk about," he said, and led me onto the dance floor. His hand settled at my waist with a gentleness that startled me. I had forgotten what it felt like to be touched as if I mattered, as if I were something more than an ornament to be displayed and then ignored. William had not danced with me in over a year, had not sought my company at social gatherings except when propriety demanded it, and even then his touch had been perfunctory, cold as marble. But Lord Hargrave's hand was warm through the silk of my gown, and when he drew me into the first steps of the waltz, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with the movement of the dance. The ballroom watched us. I could feel their eyes like pinpricks against my skin, could sense the ripple of whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Who was this man dancing with Lady Ashford? Where was her husband? What did it mean that she had removed her gloves, that she was allowing a stranger to hold her bare hand in front of all of London society? Let them whisper. Let them speculate. For the first time in 3 years, I did not care what they thought. "You dance beautifully," Lord Hargrave said, as we swept past the musician's alcove, past Lady Pemberton and her scandalized expression, past the marble columns that lined the perimeter of the room like silent sentinels. "I learned as a girl," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "My mother insisted upon it. She said that a woman who could dance well would never lack for admirers, never want for company." She paused, and something flickered across his face, an emotion I could not quite read. She was wrong, of course. One can dance beautifully and still be utterly alone. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly at my waist. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said quietly. "Though wisdom and truth are not always the same thing." We turned together, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the tall gilt mirrors that adorned the walls. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like defiance. She did not look like a woman who had perfected the art of looking away. She looked like a woman who had finally learned to see. "You have not told me why you approached me tonight," I said, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since we began to dance. "You knew about my husband and Mrs. Crawford. You knew it would humiliate me to hear it spoken aloud. Yet you told me anyway, and then you asked me to dance. Why?" He was silent for a moment, guiding me through a series of turns with a grace that suggested years of practice, of attending balls like this one and dancing with women like me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only I could hear it over the music. "Because I have been where you are, Lady Ashford. I know what it is to be married to someone who does not see you, who does not value what they have. I know what it is to watch the person you love destroy you slowly, year by year, until you forget what it felt like to be whole." I stumbled slightly, and his arm steadied me, held me closer than was strictly proper. The heat of him seeped through my gown, and I felt my heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance. "You were married," I said, and it was not quite a question. "I was," he confirmed. His eyes grew distant, shadowed by memories I could not see. "My wife died 2 years ago. Consumption," the doctors said, though I think it was something else that killed her. something that has no name in medical textbooks. I felt a pang of sympathy so sharp it took my breath away. "I am sorry for your loss," I murmured. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his face a mirror of my own pain, my own loneliness, my own desperate need to be seen by someone, anyone, who understood what it meant to live in a marriage that was a beautiful cage. "Do not be sorry," he said. "She is at peace now, more at peace than she ever was with me." The music began to slow, the final strains of the waltz winding toward their inevitable conclusion, and I felt a desperate urge to hold on to this moment, to keep dancing with this stranger who had somehow managed to break through the walls I had built around myself. But already I could see couples beginning to separate, could hear the polite applause that marked the end of one dance and the beginning of another. Our time was running out. Lord Hargrave must have sensed my reluctance, because he did not release me immediately when the music stopped. Instead, he stood there with me in the center of the ballroom, his hand still at my waist, his fingers still entwined with mine, and for a heartbeat, for one stolen moment, we were the only two people in the world. "Will you be at Lady Thornberry's garden party next week?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the chatter of the crowd. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Then I will see you there," he said, and finally, reluctantly, he released me. He bowed low over my hand, his lips not quite touching my knuckles, and when he straightened, there was something in his eyes that looked like a promise, or perhaps a warning. "Be careful, Lady Ashford. The truth has a way of changing everything once you allow yourself to see it." Before I could respond, before I could ask him what he meant, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd with the ease of a man who knew how to make himself invisible when necessary. I stood there alone, my bare hand still tingling where he had held it, my heart still pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Eleanor." The voice came from behind me, cold and sharp as winter ice. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. I had lived with that voice for 3 years, had learned to hear the displeasure in its every inflection, the barely concealed contempt that lurked beneath its cultivated courtesy. I turned slowly, giving myself time to arrange my features into the mask of serene contentment I had worn for so long. William stood before me in his evening dress, his golden hair perfectly arranged, his blue eyes hard with an anger he would never show in public. He was handsome, I thought distantly, in the way that a painting is handsome. Beautiful to look at, but ultimately lifeless, incapable of warmth or genuine emotion. Beside him stood Mrs. Vivian Crawford, her auburn curls artfully arranged, her gown cut low enough to draw the eye of every man in the room. She smiled at me with false sweetness, her green eyes glittering with triumph. There was a smudge of something on the collar of William's coat, I noticed. Powder, perhaps, or the trace of her cosmetics. The evidence of their indiscretion worn like a badge of honor for all the world to see. "Good evening, William," I said calmly, as if I had not just been told that my husband had spent the last quarter hour in the garden with his mistress, as if I had not just danced with a stranger who had shattered the fragile peace I had so carefully constructed. "Mrs. Crawford, how lovely to see you both." William's jaw tightened, and I knew that my lack of emotion infuriated him more than tears or accusations ever could. "Who was that man you were dancing with?" he demanded, his voice low but vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "Lord Sebastian Hargrave," I replied, enjoying the flicker of surprise that crossed his face. "He was kind enough to ask me to dance when I found myself without a partner." I paused, letting the words sink in, letting him hear the quiet accusation beneath them. "You were occupied elsewhere, I believe." Mrs. Crawford's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at William with something that might have been nervousness. "I was just showing William the new roses in the garden," she said, her voice pitched to carry to the nearby guests who were watching our exchange with undisguised interest. "They are quite spectacular, even in winter." "I am sure they are," I said, meeting her gaze directly and watching the color rise in her cheeks. "My husband has always had an appreciation for beautiful things." The barb landed, and I saw William's hands clench into fists at his sides. "We are leaving," he said through gritted teeth. "Now." "Of course," I replied, with perfect equanimity. "Let me retrieve my cloak." I walked away from them with my head held high, aware of the whispers that followed in my wake, aware that this night had changed something fundamental between William and me, though I could not yet say what. When I reached the entrance hall where the servants waited with coats and cloaks, I found my hands shaking so badly I could barely fasten the clasp at my throat. The carriage ride home was silent, oppressive with unspoken accusations. William sat across from me in the darkness, his face illuminated only by the occasional street lamp we passed, his expression carved from stone. I watched the city slide by outside the window, the elegant townhouses giving way to narrower streets, then back to elegance as we approached Mayfair. Somewhere out there, Lord Sebastian Hargrave was returning to his own home, his own life, carrying with him the memory of our dance. When we arrived at Ashford Manor, William did not wait for me. He strode ahead into the house, leaving me to follow in his wake like an obedient dog. The servants scattered at his approach, sensing the storm that was brewing, and by the time I reached our private chambers, he was already there, pouring himself a glass of brandy with hands that trembled with fury. "How dare you?" he said, not looking at me. "How dare you humiliate me in front of all of London by dancing with that man?" I closed the door behind me, my own hands steady now, my voice calm. "How dare I?" I repeated softly. "How dare I dance with a gentleman who asked me politely, while you were in the garden with your mistress?" He spun to face me, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But William was nothing if not controlled, nothing if not aware of appearances. He would never leave a mark that could be seen by others. "She is not my mistress," he said coldly. "She is a friend, nothing more." I laughed then, a sound that startled us both. "Of course," I said. "A friend, just as all the others were friends. Lady Blackwood, Miss Hartley, the opera singer whose name I never bothered to learn. All friends, William. All innocent diversions that have nothing to do with the fact that you have not touched your wife in 6 months, have not looked at her with anything but contempt in over a year." His face darkened, and he drained his brandy in one swallow. "You knew what this marriage was, Eleanor. You knew I needed your fortune to restore Ashford Manor, to pay my father's debts. I gave you my name, my title, a place in society. What more do you want from me?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke, acrid and poisonous. I felt something break inside me, some last fragile hope I had been clinging to without even realizing it. "Nothing," I said quietly. "I want nothing from you, William. Not anymore." I turned and walked to the door that connected my chamber to his, the door that had been locked on his side for months now. "Good night," I said, and did not wait for his response. In my own room, I sat before the vanity and unpinned my hair with trembling fingers, watching in the mirror as the elaborate coiffure came undone, as the woman who had danced with Lord Sebastian Hargrave disappeared, and the woman who was Lady Ashford returned. But something had changed, I realized. Some door had been opened that I could not close again. I thought of Sebastian's words, his warning about the truth changing everything. He was right. The truth had changed me. The truth had shown me that I did not have to accept this half-life, this slow death by 1,000 small cruelties. I could choose differently. I could step into the unknown, even if it meant risking everything I had. Outside my window, snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the city in white. I watched it for a long time, until my reflection in the glass became a ghost, until the night grew so dark I could no longer see my own face. And somewhere in that darkness, I made a promise to myself, a vow that felt as binding as any I had spoken in a church 3 years ago. I would not look away anymore. Whatever came next, whatever price I had to pay, I would face it with my eyes open and my heart, however damaged, still my own. The week that followed the ball passed with agonizing slowness. William did not speak to me except when absolutely necessary, and even then his words were clipped, formal, as cold as the December frost that clung to the windows of Ashford Manor. He left early each morning and returned late each night, and I did not ask where he went or with whom he spent his time. I had stopped asking those questions long ago, and now I found I no longer cared to know the answers. Instead, I spent my days in the library, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes that had been my companions through the loneliest hours of my marriage. I read poetry and philosophy, novels about women who were braver than I had been, who had chosen passion over propriety and paid the price gladly. The words filled something inside me that had been empty for too long, reminding me that there were other ways to live, other choices to make beyond the ones that had been made for me. On the morning of Lady Thornberry's garden party, I woke to find that the snow had melted overnight, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming in pale winter sunlight. I stood at my bedroom window and watched the servants below preparing the carriage, watched William emerge from the house in his greatcoat and top hat, watched him climb inside without so much as a glance back at the house, at the window where his wife stood watching him leave. He had business in the city, he had informed me curtly at breakfast, and would meet me at Lady Thornberry's estate later that afternoon. I had nodded and said nothing, knowing full well that his business likely involved auburn curls and a low-cut gown. I dressed carefully for the party, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the color of my eyes and made my dark hair shine like polished mahogany. My maid, Sarah, arranged my curls with trembling fingers, her young face anxious as she worked. She had been with me since I married William, had witnessed the slow dissolution of whatever affection had once existed between us. And though she never spoke of it, I knew she worried for me. "You look beautiful, my lady," she whispered, as she placed the final pin in my hair. "Like a queen." I smiled at her reflection in the mirror, touched by her loyalty. "Thank you, Sarah. That is kind of you to say." "It is only the truth, my lady," she insisted, her dark eyes serious. "Any man who cannot see it is a fool." I turned to look at her directly, surprised by her boldness. It was unlike Sarah to speak so freely, to express an opinion about matters that were far above her station. But there was something in her face that told me she could no longer remain silent, that she felt compelled to speak, even if it cost her position. "Sarah," I said gently, "you must not say such things. It is not your place." "Perhaps not, my lady," she replied, lifting her chin with a defiance I had never seen in her before. "But someone should say them. Someone should tell you that you deserve better than this, than him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I have seen the way Lord Ashford treats you, my lady. I have seen the women he brings to his club, the letters he receives perfumed with scents that are not yours. It is not right. It is not fair." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the roughness of her work-worn fingers against my own soft skin. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for caring, for seeing. But there is nothing to be done about it now. I made my choice when I married him. Choices can be unmade, my lady," Sarah said, and there was a fierce hope in her voice that made my heart ache. "If you are brave enough to unmake them." I thought about her words all through the carriage ride to Lady Thornberry's estate in Richmond, thought about them as I arrived at the grand manor house with its sweeping lawns and elaborate gardens, thought about them as I was announced and ushered into the drawing room where the other guests were already assembled. Choices can be unmade. Was it true? Could I really walk away from everything I had known, everything I had been taught to value, in pursuit of something as ephemeral as happiness? Lady Thornberry greeted me with the warmth of old friendship, though I caught the speculative gleam in her eye as she kissed my cheek. She had heard about the ball, I realized. Everyone had heard about the ball, about the stranger who had danced with Lady Ashford while her husband cavorted in the garden with his mistress, The scandal of it would fuel drawing-room gossip for weeks. "Eleanor, darling, how lovely you look," Lady Thornbury said, linking her arm through mine and leading me toward the terrace where refreshments had been laid out beneath striped awnings. "The weather has blessed us today, has it not? Perfect for a winter garden party, though I confess I worried it might be too cold. But the sun is shining, and that is all that matters." We stepped out onto the terrace, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The garden stretched before us in a riot of carefully tended winter blooms, evergreens and holly bushes heavy with red berries, paths winding between beds of frost-resistant roses and camellias that somehow thrived even in the cold. Guests strolled along the gravel walks in pairs and small groups, their voices rising and falling in the crisp air like the calls of exotic birds. And then I saw him. Lord Sebastian Hargrave stood near the fountain at the center of the garden, engaged in conversation with an elderly gentleman I recognized as Lord Pemberton. He wore a dark coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and his hair gleamed nearly black in the winter sunlight. As if sensing my gaze, he looked up, and our eyes met across the distance. Something passed between us in that moment, a recognition that went beyond words, beyond propriety, beyond anything I had ever experienced before. Lady Thornbury followed my gaze and smiled knowingly. "Ah, Lord Hargrave, such a tragic figure, is he not? Lost his wife so young and under such mysterious circumstances. They say she wasted away to nothing in their final months together, though no doctor could determine the cause." She paused, glancing at me sideways. "He has been quite reclusive since her death, rarely accepting invitations. I was surprised when he agreed to attend today." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "You know him, then?" "Only slightly," Lady Thornbury replied. "But I know of him, as does everyone in our circles. The Hargraves are an old family, nearly as old as the Ashfords, though not quite as wealthy. Sebastian inherited the title when his father died, along with considerable debts. He has spent the past 2 years rebuilding the family fortune through various business ventures, all quite successful by accounts." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They say he is looking to remarry, to secure an heir and further restore his family's standing. Every unmarried woman in London is angling for his attention." "But I am not unmarried," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Lady Thornbury squeezed my arm gently. "No, my dear, you are not. But that does not mean you cannot have friends, does it? Companions who appreciate you for who you are, not for what you bring to a marriage contract?" Before I could respond, she was pulling me forward, leading me down the terrace steps and into the garden, toward the fountain where Sebastian still stood. Lord Pemberton had moved away, leaving Sebastian alone with his thoughts, his gray eyes fixed on the water cascading from the stone cherub's urn. "Lord Hargrave," Lady Thornbury called brightly, "may I present Lady Eleanor Ashford? Though I believe you may have already made her acquaintance." He turned to us, and I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Indeed," he said, bowing to me with that same perfect calibration of respect and warmth I remembered from the ball. "It is a pleasure to see you again, Lady Ashford. I hope you have been well since we last met." "Quite well, thank you," I managed to say, though my heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. "The garden is beautiful. Lady Thornbury has created something truly remarkable here." "She has," Sebastian agreed, but his eyes never left my face. "Though I confess I find the company more remarkable than the surroundings." Lady Thornbury laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that somehow managed to convey both delight and matchmaking intentions. "How gallant of you, Lord Hargrave. I do believe I hear Lady Pemberton calling for me. If you will excuse me?" She glanced at me meaningfully. "Eleanor, do keep Lord Hargrave company for a moment, won't you? I shall return shortly." And then she was gone, disappearing back toward the terrace with a swish of her skirts, leaving me alone with Sebastian beside the fountain. The water splashed softly behind us, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the murmur of other guests, the clink of teacups on saucers, the polite laughter that was the soundtrack of every social gathering I had ever attended. "You came," Sebastian said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made my skin prickle with awareness. "I said I would," I replied, unable to look away from him. "I keep my promises." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" he asked. "Or do you keep other people's promises for them, even when they break their own to you every day?" The question hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. I felt something crack inside me, some protective shell I had built around my heart to keep the pain from showing. "How do you know so much about me?" I whispered. "How do you know about William, about our marriage?" Sebastian glanced around, ensuring that no one was within earshot, then stepped closer to me. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for my ears. "Because I know your husband, Eleanor? I have known him for years, long before you ever met him. We were at Cambridge together, shared rooms during our final year. I know what kind of man he is. I know what he is capable of." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You were friends?" "Once," Sebastian said, and something dark flickered across his features. "Before I realized what he truly was. Before I understood that he cared for nothing and no one except his own advancement, his own pleasure. He destroyed my sister, Eleanor, courted her, promised to marry her, and then abandoned her when he learned that our family was in financial difficulty. She died believing she was worthless, that no man would ever want her because William Ashford had deemed her unworthy. I could not breathe. The garden spun around me, the colors bleeding together into a nauseating swirl. "Your sister," I repeated numbly. "Catherine," he said, and I heard the ache in his voice, the grief that time had not yet healed. She was 19 years old, beautiful and kind and full of hope. William destroyed that hope, crushed it as carelessly as one might crush a flower beneath one's boot. And when I confronted him, demanded that he honor his promise to her, he laughed in my face. He said that Catherine should have known better than to believe the pretty words of a man who needed a fortune, not a pauper's daughter. The tears came then, hot and bitter, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. "I am so sorry," I choked out. "I am so sorry for what he did to her, to you. If I had known." "What would you have done?" Sebastian asked gently. "Would you have refused his proposal? Turned away from the title, the wealth, the security he offered?" "No, Eleanor. You were as much a victim of his manipulations as Catherine was. The only difference is that you survived them." He reached out and caught one of my tears on his fingertip, the gesture so intimate, so tender, that I felt my knees weaken. I wanted to lean into him, to let him hold me, while I cried for all the years I had wasted, for all the pain I had endured in silence. But we were in a garden full of people who watched our every move, who would report back to William every word we spoke, every gesture we shared. "Why did you approach me at the ball?" I asked, wiping at my eyes with trembling fingers. "Why tell me about Mrs. Crawford? Why dance with me?" His hand dropped back to his side, and he looked away, toward the fountain, toward the water that fell endlessly into the stone basin below. "Because I wanted you to know the truth," he said quietly. "Because I wanted you to see that you had a choice, that you did not have to accept his cruelty as your fate. And because—" He trailed off. And when he looked back at me, there was something raw in his eyes, something that made my heart skip a beat. "Because I saw in you what I saw in Catherine," he finished. "That quiet strength, that grace under impossible circumstances. And I could not bear to watch another woman destroy herself trying to be enough for a man who will never value her." We stood there in silence, the truth of his words settling over me like a weight. Around us, the party continued, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place beside the fountain. I thought of William, of the lies he had told me, the promises he had broken. I thought of Catherine Hargrave, a girl I had never known, but whose ghost seemed to stand between Sebastian and me. A reminder of what happened to women who trusted the wrong men. And I thought of Sarah's words that morning. Choices can be unmade. Walk with me, I said suddenly, surprising myself with my boldness. Please, I need to move, to think. Sebastian offered his arm without hesitation, and I took it, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his coat. We walked together along the garden paths, away from the terrace and the watching eyes, toward a more secluded corner where winter roses climbed a trellis and a stone bench sat half-hidden beneath bare willow branches. When we reached the bench, I turned to face him, gathering my courage. "Tell me about your wife," I said. "You said you understood what it was to be married to someone who did not see you. What did you mean?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. Then he sat down on the bench and gestured for me to join him. When I did, he began to speak, his voice soft but steady, as if he were confessing secrets he had never told another soul. "Her name was Amelia," he said. "We married when I was 25 and she was 23. It was an arranged match, orchestrated by our families to unite two old names and consolidate property. I did not love her when we wed, but I hoped that love would come in time, as it sometimes does in such marriages." He paused, his jaw tightening. It never did. Amelia was in love with someone else, a young officer who had been stationed near her family's estate. But he had no fortune, no title, nothing to offer her but his heart. So she married me instead, as her parents wished, and spent every day of our marriage mourning the life she could have had. I felt a pang of sympathy so intense it took my breath away. She must have been so unhappy. She was, Sebastian confirmed. And no matter what I did, no matter how I tried to make her comfortable, to give her freedom and respect, it was never enough. She withdrew from me completely, spent her days in her room writing letters to her lost love, letters she never sent. And then, 2 years ago, she contracted consumption. Or perhaps she simply gave up on living. I will never know for certain. I reached out without thinking and placed my hand over his. "I am sorry," I said again, inadequate words for immeasurable pain. He looked down at our joined hands, and I saw something shift in his expression, some barrier falling away. "That is why I approached you, Eleanor, not just for Catherine's sake, though that was part of it, but because I recognize what it is to live with someone who has chosen to die inside while still drawing breath. And I wanted to offer you what no one offered Amelia, what no one offered me, a glimpse of something different. A reminder that you are still alive, still capable of feeling, still worthy of being seen." The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of us, sitting on a stone bench in a winter garden while the party carried on without us. I felt something rising in my chest, something dangerous and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. It was hope, I realized. Hope that there might be a life beyond the one I had resigned myself to. Hope that I might be more than William Ashford's neglected wife, more than a woman who had perfected the art of looking away. "Sebastian," I whispered, testing the intimacy of his given name on my tongue. "What are we doing?" He turned his hand over beneath mine, our palms pressing together, fingers intertwining. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know that I have not felt this alive since before Amelia died. And I know that when I look at you, I see not just a beautiful woman, though you are that. I see someone who understands, someone who has survived what should have broken her, someone who deserves so much more than what she has been given." I leaned toward him, drawn by a force I could not name, could not resist. Our faces were inches apart now, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could feel his breath warm against my lips. One kiss, I thought. One moment of choosing something for myself, of claiming something that was mine alone. But before our lips could meet, Before I could cross that final line that would change everything, a voice called out from the path behind us, sharp and cold and unmistakably furious. "Eleanor." I jerked back as if burned, my hand flying away from Sebastian's as I turned to see William standing at the edge of the willow grove, his face white with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Behind him, I could see other guests gathering on the path, drawn by the promise of scandal, their faces alive with malicious curiosity. The choice I had been about to make hung in the air between us, unfinished, impossible now to complete. I stood slowly, feeling the world tilt beneath my feet, knowing that everything had just changed, that there would be no going back from this moment, no way to pretend that nothing had happened, that I had not been caught in a garden with another man, our hands intertwined, our faces close enough to kiss. Sebastian stood as well, placing himself slightly in front of me, a subtle gesture of protection that did not go unnoticed by William or by the growing crowd of spectators. "Lord Ashford," Sebastian said calmly, though I could hear the steel beneath his courtesy. "What a pleasant surprise. I was just speaking with your wife about the remarkable beauty of Lady Thornberry's winter roses." William's eyes blazed with fury, but his voice when he spoke was perfectly controlled, perfectly civil, as dangerous as a blade hidden in silk. "How fortunate for her to have such an attentive guide," he said. "Though I wonder if it is entirely appropriate for you to be alone with a married woman in such a secluded location." The accusation hung in the air, unsubtle despite its polite phrasing. I felt my cheeks burn with shame and anger, felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes judging me, condemning me, finding me guilty without trial. But before I could defend myself, before I could find the words to explain what they had seen or had not seen, Sebastian spoke again, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "There is nothing inappropriate about two people seeking a quiet conversation away from a crowded party," he said, "unless, of course, one assumes that Lady Ashford is incapable of maintaining her own honor, or that I am dishonorable enough to compromise her. Are you making such assumptions, Lord Ashford?" The challenge was unmistakable, deliberate. William's face darkened, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike Sebastian. Scandal and witnesses be damned. But he mastered himself with visible effort, turning his attention to me instead. "We are leaving," he said flatly. "Now." I looked at Sebastian one last time, saw the concern in his eyes, the silent question. I wanted to refuse William, to stand my ground and declare that I would stay as long as I pleased, that he had no right to command me like a disobedient child. But I knew what refusing would cost me, knew that every person watching would remember this moment, would embellish it in their retellings until the truth of what had happened was lost beneath layers of salacious gossip. So I did what I had always done. I obeyed. I walked past Sebastian without another word, past the watching guests with their hungry eyes and whispered judgments, past Lady Thornberry, who looked on with mingled pity and dismay. I followed my husband to our waiting carriage, climbed inside, and sat in silence as we drove away from the garden party, away from the winter roses and the stone bench where I had almost tasted freedom. But this time, something was different. This time, I carried with me the memory of Sebastian's touch, his words, his understanding. This time, I knew that the choice was not finished, only postponed. And when the time came to make it again, I would not hesitate. I would not look away. The silence in the carriage was suffocating. I sat across from William, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the passing scenery, though I saw nothing of it. The city rolled by in a blur of gray stone and winter sky, and all I could think about was the moment before William's voice had shattered everything. The moment when Sebastian's face had been so close to mine that I could have counted his eyelashes, could have tasted his breath on my lips. We were nearly home when William finally spoke, and his voice was so cold it made the December air seem warm by comparison. "You have made a fool of me," he said quietly, each word carefully measured, deliberately cruel. "In front of all of London, you have made me look like a cuckold, like a man who cannot control his own wife. I turned my head slowly to look at him, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt no fear, no desperate need to placate him, to smooth over his anger with apologies and submission. Instead, I felt something harder, sharper, something that tasted like the truth I had been swallowing for far too long. Control, I repeated, and heard the edge in my own voice. Is that what you think marriage is, William? Control? Ownership? His blue eyes narrowed dangerously. Marriage is a contract, Eleanor. You agreed to be my wife, to bear my name, to conduct yourself with the dignity and discretion befitting a woman of your station. Instead, you throw yourself at the first man who shows you attention, who whispers pretty lies in your ear. I laughed then, a sound without humor, bitter as wormwood. Throw myself at him? I was having a conversation, William. A conversation with another human being who treated me with more respect in 10 minutes than you have shown me in 3 years. She paused, feeling the anger rising in her chest like a tide. And you dare speak to me of dignity? You, who was in the garden at Lord Pemberton's ball with your mistress? You who comes home reeking of her perfume and expects me to pretend I do not notice? His hand shot out so quickly I had no time to react. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make me gasp in pain. You will not speak to me in that tone, he hissed, his face inches from mine. You will remember who you are, what you owe me. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, at the white marks his fingers were leaving on my skin, and something inside me went very still, very quiet. When I raised my eyes to meet his, I saw him flinch at whatever he saw in my face. Let go of me, I said, my voice deadly calm. Now. For a moment I thought he would refuse, would tighten his grip, would show me exactly what he thought of wives who dared to defy their husbands. But then the carriage rolled to a stop in front of Ashford Manor, and he released me abruptly, turning away as if the sight of me disgusted him. This is not over, he said as he climbed out of the carriage. We will discuss your behavior when I return. I have business to attend to. Business, I said softly, though he was already walking away. Of course. Mrs. Crawford must be so eager to console you after such a trying afternoon. He stopped, his shoulders stiffening, but he did not turn around. When he finally walked into the house without another word, I knew that I would not see him again until late that night, if at all. And for the first time, instead of feeling abandoned, I felt relieved. I sat in the carriage for a long moment after he disappeared, watching the front door of Ashford Manor as if it were the entrance to a prison I had been locked inside for 3 years. My wrist throbbed where William had grabbed me, and I knew that by tomorrow there would be bruises, evidence of his rage that I would have to hide beneath long sleeves and careful lies, just as I had hidden everything else. But I was tired of hiding. I was tired of lies. When I finally entered the house, I found Sarah waiting for me in the entrance hall, her face anxious and pale. She took one look at me and rushed forward, reaching for my hands. "My lady, are you hurt?" I heard Lord Ashford shouting at the servants when he came in. He seemed angry, I finished for her, pulling my hands away before she could see the marks on my wrist. He was angry, Sarah, but it does not matter now. I paused, looking around the grand entrance hall with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, seeing it as if for the first time. All of this wealth, all of this beauty, and none of it had ever been mine. It had always belonged to William, to the Ashford name, to a legacy I had been foolish enough to think I could become part of. Tell me something, Sarah. If you could leave this house, if you had somewhere else to go, would you? Sarah's eyes widened. My lady, I do not understand. Are you asking if I wish to seek employment elsewhere? No, I said quietly. I am asking if you would come with me, if I decided to leave, if I decided that I could not stay here any longer, that I would rather have nothing than continue to have everything at the cost of my own soul. The words hung in the air between us, dangerous and irrevocable. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty. She was young, barely 20, and her position in this house was all that stood between her and poverty. To leave with me, to attach herself to a woman who was contemplating abandoning her husband, would be to risk everything. But then she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, and I saw something fierce and loyal in her expression that made my eyes sting with unshed tears. "I would go with you anywhere, my lady," she said firmly. "Anywhere at all." I reached out and squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by the gift she had just given me. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for believing that I am worth following into uncertainty." She smiled, a small, brave smile. "You are worth more than this house, my lady, more than all the gold in Lord Ashford's coffers. Anyone with eyes can see that." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I was worth something beyond my fortune, beyond my name, beyond my usefulness as an ornament in William's life. But 3 years of his contempt had worn away my confidence, had made me doubt everything I had once known about myself. I went upstairs to my chambers and locked the door behind me, something I never did, something that felt like a small act of rebellion. I removed my emerald gown and stood before the mirror in my chemise, examining the bruises that were already beginning to bloom on my wrist like dark flowers. William's handprint, the evidence of his ownership, his anger at being embarrassed in public. I touched the marks gently, feeling the tenderness, the pain that would last for days. And as I stood there, I made a decision. I would not let him touch me again. I would not let him mark me, bruise me, break me down piece by piece until there was nothing left of the woman I had once been. Whatever it cost me, whatever I had to sacrifice, I would find a way to be free. A soft knock sounded at my door, and I grabbed a dressing gown, pulling it on quickly to hide the bruises. "Come in," I called, expecting Sarah. But it was not Sarah who entered. It was Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s who had served the Ashford family for 40 years. She stood in the doorway with a silver tray in her hands, and on the tray was a single letter sealed with unfamiliar wax. "This arrived for you, my lady," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "By special messenger." The boy said it was urgent. I took the letter from the tray, my heart beginning to race as I looked at the seal. It was not William's crest, nor any crest I recognized. When Mrs. Hartwell had left and I was alone again, I broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the thick paper. The handwriting was strong and clear, unmistakably masculine, and I knew before I read the first word who had written it. "My dear Lady Ashford, I hope this letter finds you well, though I fear that our encounter this afternoon may have caused you distress. Please know that I take full responsibility for any difficulty my presence may have created for you. That was never my intention, though I cannot bring myself to regret the time we spent together in Lady Thornbury's garden. I have been thinking about what you said, about choices and their consequences. You are right to be cautious, right to consider carefully before making any decision that cannot be undone. But I want you to know that you are not without options, not without allies. If you should ever need assistance, if you should ever require a friend who understands what you are facing, you have only to send word. My estate in Derbyshire is called Hartwick Hall. It is remote, private, and safe. If you should ever need a place to go, a place where you can think clearly without fear of judgment or retribution, my home is at your disposal. I will ask nothing of you in return except the opportunity to help you, as I could not help Catherine, as I could not help Amelia. I do not write this to pressure you or to suggest that you owe me anything. I write it because I believe you deserve to know that you have choices, that you are not trapped, that there is a world beyond the one you have known these past 3 years. A world where you could be valued for who you are, not for what you can provide. Yours in friendship and respect, Sebastian Hargrave. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking so badly that the paper rustled like autumn leaves. He was offering me a way out, a safe haven, a place to go if I found the courage to leave William. It was more than I had dared to hope for, more than I deserved from a man I barely knew. But even as hope bloomed in my chest, fear followed close behind. To accept Sebastian's offer would be to create a scandal that would follow me for the rest of my life. A married woman fleeing to the estate of an unmarried man. Society would crucify me. I would lose everything, my reputation, my position, whatever small amount of independence my marriage settlements had provided. I would become an outcast, a cautionary tale whispered about in drawing rooms across England. And yet, what did I have now that was worth keeping? A husband who despised me? A title that felt like a chain around my neck? The approval of people who gossiped about my humiliation behind their fans while smiling to my face? I walked to my writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, dipping my pen in ink. I did not know what I would write, did not know if I had the courage to accept what Sebastian was offering. But I knew I had to respond, had to acknowledge the gift he had given me, even if I could not yet bring myself to accept it. Dear Lord Hargrave. I began, and then stopped, staring at the formal address. It seemed wrong after everything we had shared, after the intimacy of his letter. I crumpled the paper and started again. Dear Sebastian. Your letter arrived at a moment when I needed most to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world. I am grateful for your offer, more grateful than I can properly express in words. To know that I have somewhere to go, should I need it, is a comfort beyond measure. But I must be honest with you, as you have been honest with me. I am afraid. Afraid of what leaving would mean, of what I would lose, of who I would become if I walked away from everything I have known. I have been Lady Ashford for 3 years, and before that, I was Eleanor Hartwell of Hampshire, daughter of a minor gentleman with more debts than sense. I do not know who I would be without a name to define me, without a role to play. You speak of choices, and you are right that I have them, but every choice has a price, and I am not sure I am brave enough to pay it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I will keep your letter safe, and I will remember your offer. And if the day comes when I find the courage you seem to believe I possess, I will send word. Until then, please know that your friendship means more to me than you can imagine. Yours, Eleanor. I sealed the letter and hid it in the drawer of my writing desk, beneath a stack of old correspondence. I would find a way to send it tomorrow, when William was out, and I could trust one of the servants to deliver it without questions. That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, waiting for William to return. But he did not come home. Not at midnight, not at 1, not at 2. The clock in the hallway struck 3 before I finally fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of gardens and stone benches and a man whose gray eyes saw through all the masks I wore. I woke to gray dawn light, filtering through my curtains, and the sound of raised voices downstairs. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding, wondering if William had finally returned, if he was taking out his anger on the servants. But the voices were not angry, I realized, as I listened more carefully. They were frightened. I threw on my dressing gown and hurried downstairs, following the commotion to the entrance hall. Mrs. Hartwell stood there with 2 constables, their faces grave, their uniforms crisp and official in the morning light. Sarah was there too, her face white as chalk, her hands pressed to her mouth. "My lady," Mrs. Hartwell said when she saw me, her voice shaking. "These gentlemen are from Scotland Yard. They have come about Lord Ashford." The world seemed to slow down around me. I looked at the constables, at their solemn expressions, and knew before they spoke what they had come to tell me. "Lady Ashford," the older constable said, removing his hat. "I am afraid I have difficult news. Your husband was found this morning in his club. He appears to have suffered a heart seizure during the night. The doctor says it was very quick. He would not have suffered." The words washed over me like a wave, and I felt my knees begin to buckle. Sarah rushed forward to support me, her small hands surprisingly strong as she guided me to a chair. I sat down heavily, staring at the constables without really seeing them. William was dead. My husband, the man I had married 3 years ago with such hope and foolish love, was dead. I should have been devastated. I should have collapsed in grief, should have wept for the loss of him. But all I felt was a terrible, hollow numbness. And beneath it, like a dark current running through deep water, something that felt horribly like relief. "I am sorry for your loss, my lady," the younger constable was saying. "If there is anything we can do, anyone we should notify on your behalf." "His sister," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. "Lady Margaret Thornbury. She will want to know. And his solicitor, Mr. Pemberton in Lincoln's Inn." They nodded, made notes, asked questions. I answered automatically without thinking. And all the while, I felt Sebastian's letter burning in the drawer upstairs, his offer of escape that I no longer needed, because I was free now. A widow at 24, released from my marriage vows by an act of God or fate or blind chance. I did not need to run away, did not need to sacrifice my reputation or my position. I did not need to choose between the life I had and the life I wanted. William's death had chosen for me. When the constables finally left, when the servants had scattered to spread the news through the household and prepare for the flood of visitors that would inevitably come, I sat alone in the entrance hall and stared at the place where my husband had stood just yesterday, shouting at the staff in his rage. The marks on my wrist throbbed beneath my dressing gown. His final gift to me, the last proof of his ownership. I touched them gently, feeling the pain, feeling the strange absence of the man who had made them. And then slowly, I began to cry. Not for William, not for the marriage we had never truly had, or the love that had never been real. I cried for the girl I had been 3 years ago, the one who had believed in happy endings and honest promises. I cried for Catherine Hargrave, who had died believing herself worthless. I cried for Amelia, who had wasted away rather than live without the man she loved. And I cried for myself, for the woman who had survived when she should have been destroyed, who had learned to look away and now had to learn how to see again. When Sarah found me an hour later, I was still sitting in the entrance hall, my face wet with tears, my body shaking with the force of my grief and relief and confusion. She knelt beside me and took my hands in hers, and together we sat in silence as the morning light grew stronger, as the city woke around us, as the news of William Ashford's death spread through London like wildfire. I was a widow now. I was free. But I did not yet know what that freedom meant, or what I would do with it, or whether Sebastian's offer still stood now that I no longer needed to flee. All I knew was that the choice was mine at last, and mine alone. And that terrified me more than anything William had ever done. The weeks following William's death passed in a blur of black crepe and hushed voices, of condolence calls I received with appropriate solemnity while feeling nothing but numbness inside. Society demanded that I mourn, and so I mourned, draping myself in widow's weeds and retreating from public life as was expected of a grieving wife. But alone in my chambers at night, I would touch the fading bruises on my wrist and feel not sorrow, but a profound sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted and I no longer knew which direction was forward. William's funeral was a grand affair, attended by everyone who mattered in London society. They came to pay their respects to one of their own, to a man who had been handsome and charming and well-connected. Even if privately, they had all known about his mistresses and his debts and his cruelty to the wife, who now stood beside his grave with dry eyes and a face like carved marble. I watched them watching me, saw them exchange glances when my tears did not fall, heard the whispers that followed me like shadows. "She does not weep," they said. "How strange, how unnatural. Perhaps she is in shock." Or perhaps she did not love him as much as she should have. Let them whisper, I thought, as the vicar intoned prayers over William's coffin. Let them judge. They had judged me throughout my marriage, had pitied me and gossiped about me, and done nothing to help me. Their opinions meant nothing now. Sebastian did not attend the funeral. It would have been inappropriate, given that we had no public connection, given that his presence would only fuel the rumors that had already begun to circulate about what had happened at Lady Thornberry's garden party. But he sent flowers, white roses without a card, and when they were delivered to Ashford Manor, I knew immediately who they were from. I kept them in my sitting room where I could see them, a silent reminder that somewhere in this cold city was a man who understood, who cared, who had offered me a refuge I had not yet had the courage to accept. It was Mr. Pemberton, William's solicitor, who finally shattered the fragile peace of my mourning. He arrived at Ashford Manor 2 weeks after the funeral, his face grave and troubled, carrying a leather case filled with documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my late husband. Lady Ashford, he said when we were seated in the library, the same library where I had spent so many lonely hours during my marriage. I am afraid I have some distressing news regarding Lord Ashford's estate. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. What kind of news, Mr. Pemberton? He opened his case and withdrew a sheaf of papers, spreading them on the desk between us. Lord Ashford's financial situation was far more precarious than you may have realized, he said carefully. The estate is encumbered with significant debts, gambling debts, primarily, along with loans taken against the property to maintain his lifestyle. He paused, looking at me with something that might have been sympathy. I am afraid that your marriage settlement, the fortune you brought to this union, has been almost entirely depleted. The words took a moment to penetrate, to make sense. My fortune, the money my father had left me, the security I had believed would at least give me some independence even within the confines of my marriage, was gone. William had spent it all, had gambled it away on cards and horses and the mistresses he had paraded through his life while I sat at home and practiced the art of looking away. How much is left? I asked quietly. After settling the outstanding debts and funeral expenses, Mr. Pemberton said, barely meeting my eyes, there will be approximately £500 per annum, enough to live on. If you are careful, but certainly not enough to maintain Ashford Manor or your current standard of living. I felt a hysterical laugh building in my throat and forced it down. So I am not only a widow, I said, but a poor widow. How perfectly fitting. There is one other matter, Mr. Pemberton continued, and now he looked genuinely uncomfortable. It has come to my attention that Lord Ashford made certain arrangements with Mrs. Vivian Crawford. Specifically, he settled an annual income on her of £1,000. This arrangement was made shortly after your marriage and has continued until his death. The numbers swam before my eyes. £1,000 for his mistress, while I was left with 500. Even in death, William had found a way to diminish me, to prove that I had never been worth as much to him as the woman who warmed his bed. I see, I said, and was proud that my voice remained steady. Thank you for informing me, Mr. Pemberton. I will need time to consider my options. After he left, I sat alone in the library and stared at the walls lined with books I had read to fill the empty hours of my marriage. Ashford Manor would have to be sold, or let at the very least. I could not afford to maintain it on £500 a year. I would have to leave London, would have to find somewhere cheaper to live, somewhere I could survive on the scraps William had left me, or I could write to Sebastian. The thought came unbidden, dangerous, impossible to ignore. He had offered me his home, his protection, his friendship. The offer had been made when I was still married, when accepting it would have meant scandal and ruin. But I was a widow now, and while society might raise their eyebrows at a friendship between a young widow and an unmarried man, it would not be the catastrophe it would have been before. I pulled out his letter from where I had hidden it in my desk drawer, read it again with new eyes. My estate in Derbyshire is called Hartwick Hall. It is remote, private, and safe. If you should ever need a place to go, a place where you can think clearly without fear of judgment or retribution, my home is at your disposal. Could I do it? Could I write to him, accept his generosity, allow myself to depend on someone again after everything William had done? The thought terrified me. But so did the alternative, retreating to some cramped cottage in the countryside, living out my days as a poor relation, forever defined by the man who had destroyed me financially, even as he destroyed me emotionally. I took out a sheet of paper and began to write before I could change my mind. Dear Sebastian, I find myself in need of the refuge you so generously offered. William's death has left me in circumstances I did not anticipate, and I can no longer remain in London. If your offer still stands, if Hartwick Hall is still available to me, I would be grateful for the opportunity to accept your hospitality for a time until I can determine my path forward. I do not write this lightly, nor do I wish to impose upon your kindness. But I find that I am tired of pretending to be strong, tired of facing each day alone with no one who understands what I have endured. You said once that you saw in me what you saw in your sister, that quiet strength and grace under impossible circumstances. I hope you were right, because I will need all the strength I can muster for what comes next. If you are willing to receive me, I will come within the fortnight. I will bring only my maid, Sarah, and what few possessions I can carry. Everything else belongs to the Ashford estate, and I find I do not want any of it anyway. Let them sell it all. Let them distribute it among William's creditors. I want nothing that carries his name, nothing that reminds me of the 3 years I lost trying to be enough for a man who valued me less than his horses. Yours, Eleanor. I sealed the letter and gave it to Sarah to post, and then I waited through the long April days as spring crept into London, waited through the nights when I lay awake, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if Sebastian would write back with regrets and excuses, if I would be left stranded with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But his response came within 3 days, and when I opened it, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words. My dear Eleanor, your letter has been the answer to a question I have been asking myself since the day of William's funeral. I have thought of you constantly these past weeks, wondered how you were bearing up under the weight of grief and obligation, wished I could offer you more than flowers and silent sympathy. Now you have given me the opportunity to do just that, and I accept with a joy I cannot adequately express. Hartwick Hall awaits you. I have instructed my housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, to prepare the best rooms for you and for Sarah. You will want for nothing here, I promise you. The estate is yours to enjoy as you see fit. The library is extensive if you wish to read. The gardens are beautiful in spring if you wish to walk. And the village nearby is friendly if you wish for company. But if you wish only for solitude and peace, that too will be yours. I do not expect anything from you, Eleanor. I do not write this with any hidden agenda or improper intentions. I offer you sanctuary because you deserve it, because you have survived what should have broken you, and because I believe that given time and space and freedom from judgment, you will discover who you truly are beneath all the roles you have been forced to play. Come to Hartwick as soon as you are able. I will be here waiting, not as a suitor or a rescuer, but as a friend who understands what it is to be lost and who hopes that together we might both find our way home. Yours always, Sebastian. I read the letter until I had memorized every word, until the paper was soft from my handling of it. And then I began to make arrangements to leave London, to close up Ashford Manor, and settle what affairs needed settling before I could escape the city that had been my prison for 3 years. Lady Thornbury came to call the day before I was to depart, sweeping into my sitting room in a rustle of silk and concern. My dear Eleanor, she said, taking my hands in hers, is it true? Are you really leaving London? I am, I confirmed. There is nothing left for me here, and I find I need the quiet of the countryside to recover from everything that has happened. She studied my face for a long moment, her eyes knowing and kind. You are going to him, are you not? To Lord Hargrave? I did not see any point in lying. He has offered me his hospitality during my mourning period, I said carefully. As a friend, nothing more. Lady Thornberry smiled, a small, sad smile that held more understanding than judgment. My dear, she said gently, I am not here to scold you or warn you away. I am here to tell you that I think you are doing exactly the right thing. William was a cruel man. We all knew it, even if we did not speak of it. You owe his memory nothing, least of all your continued suffering. If Lord Hargrave can offer you peace, if he can help you heal from what you have endured, then go to him with my blessing. Tears sprang to my eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for understanding. She squeezed my hands once more, and then released them. Be happy, Eleanor. That is all any of us truly wants in this life. Be happy, and do not let the whispers of small-minded people keep you from it. After she left, I finished my packing with a lighter heart. Sarah worked beside me, carefully folding gowns and wrapping my few precious belongings in tissue paper, and I saw the hope in her young face, the excitement at this new adventure we were embarking on together. Are you frightened, my lady? She asked as we worked. About going to Derbyshire? About staying with Lord Hargrave? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I admitted. But I am more frightened of staying here, of living the rest of my life in the shadow of a man who never valued me. At least at Hartwick, I will have the chance to discover who I am when no one is telling me who I should be. The journey to Derbyshire took 2 days, and with every mile that passed, I felt the weight on my chest growing lighter. We traveled through the greening countryside, past villages waking to spring, past fields where lambs gambled and farmers worked the soil. The world was coming back to life, and I felt as if I were waking with it, as if I had been asleep for 3 years and was only now beginning to remember what it felt like to be truly alive. Hartwick Hall appeared on the afternoon of the 2nd day, rising from the landscape like something out of a dream. It was smaller than Ashford Manor, but infinitely more welcoming, built of honey-colored stone that glowed in the spring sunlight. Gardens surrounded it on all sides, riot of color and life, and as our carriage rolled up the drive, I saw Sebastian standing on the front steps waiting for us. He had changed since I last saw him. He looked less haunted somehow, younger, as if the weight he had been carrying had lifted slightly. When the carriage stopped and he came forward to help me down, his hand was warm and steady in mine, his gray eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Welcome to Hartwick Hall," he said softly. "Welcome home, Eleanor." And standing there in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by gardens and birdsong and the promise of new beginnings, I finally understood what he meant. Home was not a place, not a house with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Home was wherever I could be myself, without fear, without judgment, without the need to look away from the truth of my own heart. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever known. Sebastian gave me the freedom to be as I chose, to spend my days however I wished without obligation or expectation. Some days I walked in the gardens with Sarah, marveling at the roses and lavender that grew wild and beautiful. Other days I sat in the library and read, devouring books I had never been allowed to enjoy during my marriage, poetry and philosophy, and novels about women who made their own choices and lived with the consequences. And some days, Sebastian and I simply talked. We talked about Catherine and Amelia, about William and all the ways he had damaged the people who loved him. We talked about grief and guilt and the strange relief that came with being free of marriages that had been cages. We talked about the future, about what it might look like to build a life on honest foundations instead of pretty lies. He did not rush me. He did not press for more than I was ready to give. He simply existed beside me, a steady presence, a reminder that there were good men in the world, men who kept their promises and valued the women in their lives as equals rather than possessions. One evening in late May, we stood together in the garden, watching the sun set over the Derbyshire hills. The air was soft and warm, scented with roses and newly cut grass, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. "Eleanor," Sebastian said quietly, and when I turned to look at him, I saw something new in his face, something that looked like hope. "I know it is too soon. I know you need time to heal, to discover who you are outside of being William's wife. But I want you to know that when you are ready, if you ever wish it, I would be honored to court you properly. Not as a widow and a widower seeking consolation, but as two people who have survived the worst and found each other on the other side." I looked at him, this man who had given me sanctuary when I needed it most, who had asked nothing in return except the privilege of helping me heal, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, I would not face it alone. "I am not ready yet," I said honestly. "I need to learn who Eleanor is before I can be anyone's wife again. But when I am ready, Sebastian, when I have found myself and know that I can stand on my own, I hope you will still be here." He smiled, that real smile that reached his eyes and made him look young and unguarded. "I will be here," he promised. "For as long as you need me, I will be here." The summer passed in a golden haze of long days and longer conversations. I learned to laugh again, learned to take joy in simple pleasures, learned to look at my reflection in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back at me. She was not the girl who had married William Ashford 3 years ago, full of naive hope and foolish dreams. Nor was she the hollow ghost who had perfected the art of looking away. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had been tested and had emerged scarred but unbroken. By autumn, I knew what I wanted. I knew that Sebastian had become essential to me, not as a rescuer or a substitute for the husband I had lost, but as a partner, an equal, someone who saw me clearly and loved what he saw. And I knew that I was ready to take the risk again, to open my heart to the possibility of love, even knowing how badly it could end. We were married in December, exactly 1 year after the night he had first approached me at Lord Pemberton's ball and whispered the truth I had needed to hear. It was a small ceremony in the village church near Hartwick, attended only by Sarah and a handful of local friends. There were no grand displays, no society gossip, no pretense of anything except two people choosing each other freely and honestly. When Sebastian slipped the ring onto my finger, when he looked into my eyes and promised to honor and cherish me for all the days of his life, I believed him. And when I made my own vows, promising to stand beside him through whatever trials might come, I knew I would keep them. Because this time, I was not marrying to escape or to please anyone else. I was marrying because I had found a man who valued me, who saw my strength and my scars and loved me not in spite of them, but because of them. I was marrying because I had learned that love was not about perfection or performance, but about honesty and respect and the courage to be vulnerable with another human being. That night, as we stood together in the garden at Hartwick Hall, watching the first snow of winter fall soft and silent around us, Sebastian took my hand in his. "Do you remember," he asked, "when I told you that the truth changes everything once you allow yourself to see it?" "I remember," I said, leaning into his warmth. "I was right," he said. "The truth did change everything. It brought you to me. It gave us both a second chance at happiness." I turned to face him, this man who had offered me refuge when I needed it most, who had waited patiently while I found my way back to myself. "No," I said softly, "you brought me to myself first, and that made all the difference." He kissed me then, gentle and sure, and I felt something settle into place inside me, some final piece of the puzzle that was my life clicking home. I had spent 3 years perfecting the art of looking away, learning to survive by pretending not to see the truth of my own unhappiness, but I would spend the rest of my life looking forward, seeing clearly, choosing consciously, living honestly. The snow fell around us like a benediction, covering the garden in white, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and clean and full of possibility. And standing there in Sebastian's arms, I finally understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. The choice to see, to speak, to act, to love. The choice to be, at long last, exactly who I was meant to be.